I've always really liked my neighborhood. Bard Street, number 1287. It was the home my wife and I bought when we were expecting our first child. It was filled with small, single-family homes, and all of them well-maintained and loved. I live in a cul-de-sac bordering several acres of wooded and undeveloped land. It's a pretty spot, close to the heart of downtown, but it felt isolated thanks to the trees that surrounded us. I could walk out on my deck in the morning with my coffee and listen to the birds sing and the squirrels chitter. At night, there were always a plethora of lightning bugs that my kids loved to chase. It was a little tiny slice of suburbia heaven. I even liked my neighbors. We had barbecues and babysat each other's kids like they did in the 1950s. One of our neighbors is named Miss Scholes. She had lived in her house for decades, and as far as I know, the neighborhood had grown up around her. Her house was an older Cape Cod-style home that contrasted with the modern-looking homes in the neighborhood. I never knew her husband. He was dead long before we had moved in. She seemed to like having people around, and you could always find her on the front porch in the warm months, sipping tea and sewing her quilts. She was a master quilter. I had seen many of her pieces and was always amazed at their level of detail. They resembled paintings more than cloth. She was famous in the community for them. Every year, she would enter her quilts in the county fair or donate them for auctions to raise money for charitable causes. She was a lovely old lady with frost-white hair that she kept up in a bun, who maintained the nicest garden on the block. She grew flowers, vegetables, and even fruit from a cherry and apple tree that flourished in her front yard. And she always had her cats. Over the years, she had dozens of the furry companions, but none as large as her favorite cat, Diego. He was a massive cat with a glorious coat of long charcoal gray fur. I assumed he was a Maine Coon, but I never knew for sure. He had been often mistaken for a bobcat due to his size. But he was a sweetheart. Diego patrolled the neighborhood like an old-world constable, walking leisurely up and down the street, sniffing the things that could be sniffed. The kids adored him and played with him like he was a dog. He was immensely patient and tolerated their hugs and kisses. During the school year, he would wait with the children at the bus stop, assuming the role of a benevolent shepherd as he sat with the children. He liked our house second best after Miss Scholes. I think it was because our garden always received lots of sun throughout the day. Besides, I actually enjoyed seeing him sleeping amongst the hydrangeas or climbing our maple tree. I loved cats, but we couldn't have one because my wife was allergic. I have many sweet memories of sipping coffee on our back porch with Diego purring beside me. One day, one of our elderly neighbors, Mr. Carmody, passed away. Next to Miss Scholes, he had been in the neighborhood the longest. He had been in his late 80s and hadn't been able to get out much as his arthritis got worse with age. But he had always been happy to see us and would wave at the children as they played. Even though he hadn't really been a friend to us, he had been a fixture in our lives for over a decade, and his absence was jarring. The kids cried. They didn't know him very well either, but the sudden, permanent change to their lives was upsetting to them. We all went to his funeral, which was sparsely attended, save for a few relatives and the people from the neighborhood. He had outlived most of his family and friends. This was the first time we had gotten to meet Mr. Carmody's grandson, Victor. He had several grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but Victor was the one that stood out. He was tall and lean to the point of being gangly. He reminded me in passing of a scarecrow. He wore dress pants and a faded plaid shirt that had seen better days. We only spoke to him briefly, just to give our condolences. He didn't take my hand when I offered it, and instead gave me a dull, almost uninterested look. I shrugged it off. He must have been tired and bereaved from the whole ordeal. 3 days later, I saw Victor again, this time in front of Mr. Carmody's house with a beer in hand, even though it was barely 9 o'clock in the morning. He was supervising a moving crew who were busy jostling furniture and boxes into the home. I was curious, so I walked over and waved, hoping to elicit a better response than the one I had received at the funeral. I could smell the alcohol and stale cigarette smoke even several feet away from him. Victor regarded me with a cold hostility as he sipped at his beer. The air around him felt colder, and my smile slipped from my face. "Hello. We met at your grandfather's funeral. I'm sorry that he's gone. He was a great neighbor to all of us," I said, still trying to be friendly. Victor looked me in the eye and shrugged.
"People die,"
he said, with so little inflection, he might as well have made a comment on the weather. I coughed, clearing my throat as I tried to think of something else to say. I nodded at the house. "So are you clearing out his things?"
"He left me the house. No one else wanted it. Everyone else lives in Florida, and I didn't want to be bothered with living in the Midwest."
Victor suddenly spoke, surprising me. Mentally, I cringed. If he was moving in, I wasn't thrilled. I already didn't like him, and our neighborhood had always been a pretty great place to live.
"What is that?"
Victor spat, his eyes narrowing as he looked down and behind me to something I couldn't see. I felt something slide past my leg, and I heard the loud purring before I could look down. I knew it was Diego, coming to greet the new neighbor. "Oh, this is Diego. He's Mrs. Scholl's cat. He's a big fixture in the neighborhood." I bent down to give Diego a quick scratch behind the ears. Victor backed away and practically spat at poor Diego.
"Cats are the vilest thing on this earth. They're little demons. Little demons with their evil little snake eyes."
He spat as he spoke, spittle and beer leaving his mouth in a mist. I backed away, suddenly terrified at his outburst. He had gotten angry so quickly, and over a cat who couldn't even hurt him. Diego is a sweetheart. He's like a puppy most of the time. The kids play with him, I said, trying to defuse the situation. Victor was staring at the cat with such intense hatred that it scared me. He took a last swig of his beer, downed it, and then tossed the empty can straight at Diego's head. It missed and hit me in the shin instead. Diego scampered off as I bent to rub at my shin. "What the hell, man? You hit me with that thing." I wished that I knew how to throw a punch. But at the moment, escalating the situation probably wouldn't have been a good idea.
"They're little demons. Little demons sent from hell. I always knew it,"
Victor screeched, not even looking at me, but at the fleeing form of Diego. I went back home and told my wife everything. She wanted to call the cops, but I wasn't sure that they could do anything. We both agreed that we should keep ourselves, our kids, and our dog away from Victor. If he was that volatile with a cat, we had no idea how he would be with the kids. I sent texts to all the neighbors as well, explaining what happened. We didn't text Miss Scholes, as she only had a landline. I assured my wife that I would talk to her as soon as I could. The next morning, we began finding the dead cats. It was laying dead in the middle of the road, between my lawn and Miss Scholes' front porch. It was obvious that the poor feline had been run over. It was a smaller black cat that I didn't recognize. Miss Scholes was already out on her front porch, drinking a cup of herbal tea. She was staring forlornly at the deceased animal when I walked up to her. "That poor thing," she sniffed and wiped at her eye. "That vile man didn't even slow down when he was crossing the street." I didn't have to ask who she meant. I already knew. I comforted Mrs. Scholes as best I could before I went to inspect the body of the cat. He had a collar and a name tag, so I sent the owner a text explaining that I had found their cat. When they called back, They were crying, wondering what happened to their furry friend. The cat's name was Felix, and he was an inside cat that had gotten loose last night. I felt terrible explaining what happened to his owners. I left out the information about Victor. I couldn't prove that it was intentional. Maybe Victor hadn't really seen the cat. They came to collect the body, and my wife kept the kids occupied out back while they did it. They loved animals, and seeing it would have only upset them. The next day, there was another dead cat, this time without a collar, and it was laying in Mr. Harden's driveway, almost like it had been placed there. Mr. Harden found it and had texted everyone asking if we recognized the animal. No one did, and we all assumed it was a stray. This one hadn't been run over. It had been drowned. Its poor body was bloated with water. We didn't live near any large bodies of water, so I assumed it had to have been placed there from somewhere else. It was that man, that Victor, my wife accused. I didn't disagree with her, as I was assuming the same thing. It scared me. The man had only been moved in for 2 days, and we were finding dead animals in our road and our driveways. Wasn't animal cruelty a sign of sociopathy? Most of the people in the cul-de-sac had kids and pets. Was this guy going to be a risk to everyone? My wife and I talked more, but we weren't sure what to do. We couldn't prove anything, and the last thing we wanted to do was start tossing accusations. But we kept finding dead animals. It upset the kids greatly. They were usually the first ones up in the morning since they had to get ready for school, and if a body was laying in the street, they would be the first to spot it. Usually, it was cats. Some had collars, and some didn't. But there were other animals too. Birds, dogs, rabbits, and even a rotting skunk was left on Miss Scholl's driveway like a sick offering. I had never seen Mrs. Scholl's angry, but as the weeks wore on, I could see the hatred glinting in her eyes every time Victor drove past in his car. He never came outside his house. We had no idea what he did for a living either. The yard, once well maintained by the late Mr. Carmody even in his old age, was becoming decrepit. He never mowed the yard, and he refused any help we offered. What was worse was that the whole neighborhood started to smell faintly of rotting animals. We could never find all the corpses, but we suspected they were coming from Victor's house. My wife was beyond stressed. She was a stay-at-home mom, and when the kids were in school, she would maintain the house and create art to sell on Etsy. On nice days, she'd sit outside to work and let the dog run around the backyard. She swore that Victor would always leer at her if he saw her outside alone. So, she stopped going outside. She drove to a local park to walk our dog, when before, she would walk him around the neighborhood. We installed one of those camera doorbells, so we had some kind of security. So far, he hadn't come on to our property, and it helped ease my wife's mind. Everyone else hadn't been so lucky. The Vaughn family, consisting of a single mom with 2 teenage girls, had told us that she had caught Victor staring into the younger girl's bedroom window while she was getting dressed for school. Her house was right next to Victor, and the girl's bedroom window faced his home. She had confronted him, and the man had just laughed, saying he thought he dropped something and was looking for it. After that, she had the girls keep their window blinds closed at all times. Through group chat and texting, we learned all of us were having run-ins with Victor. Our neighbors, the Nugents, had reached out to Victor's family asking for information on him. All his family had said was to keep their doors locked and their pets inside. They said that no one in the Carmody family associated with him due to several incidents from when he was a young man, but they refused to elaborate on what those incidents were. I was at a loss. I thought about threatening Victor. I thought about buying the house from him. I even thought of burning the place down when he went to work. None of these options would work. At least none that wouldn't end up with me in the jailhouse or the poorhouse. The breaking point came on a cool Saturday morning in August. I was making chocolate chip pancakes in the kitchen when I heard a loud wail from outside. We all heard it and froze. The kids looked around quizzically, but my wife and I locked eyes as we realized the wailing was coming from Mrs. Skoll's house. I turned the burner on the stove off and looked outside. Mrs. Skoll's was on the ground, screaming, cradling something against her chest, and I could see blood surrounding her. My mouth went dry. I thought she had been hit by a car. "Stay in the house," I shouted at my wife and kids as I ran outside in my pajamas, grabbing my phone on the way out. I ran to Mrs. Skoll's with my heart thumping. She looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, and I breathed a sigh of relief when I realized it was not her blood. But I gasped as I realized whose blood it was. It was Diego. The sweet old cat was cradled against her chest, and he was obviously dead. A large wound on his side was evidence of what killed him. A trail of blood was on the asphalt, leading from the driveway of Victor Carmody to the arms of Mrs. Skoll's. He killed him. I know he killed him. He killed my sweet Diego, she rasped, her voice already harsh from crying. I teared up as well. Diego had been my friend. Behind me, I heard the door to my house open, and the voices of my children. "Dad, what happened?" My son called out. I placed myself between him and Mrs. Skoll's to spare him the sight, but it was too late. He had seen. All over the cul-de-sac, my neighbors were exiting their front doors, peering behind curtains, and running over with cell phones in hand, ready to call the police, or fire department, or whomever. I looked at the faces of my neighbors, and we all must have been thinking the same thing. It was Victor. Victor had killed Diego. The blood trail was evidence enough. Mr. Roth, a large man in his 50s who lived next to Mrs. Skoll's, stormed over to Victor's house and started beating on the door. His wife, Cynthia, jogged after him, pleading with him to stop. "Mark, you can't provoke him. That cat has been stabbed, and you're crazy if you think that man won't take a stab at you too," she screamed at him, but he didn't stop. He banged on the door and shouted for Victor and yelled curses. The door never opened, and Victor never appeared, not so much as a peek out of his window. Mrs. Skoll's was still crying, but she turned to look at Victor's house. Her eyes, bloodshot from crying, took on a fierce look. I had never seen my neighbor angry before. My wife knelt next to the elderly woman and gently placed her arms around her shoulders. "I'm so sorry. Is there anything we can do? Is there anyone you'd like us to call?" my wife asked tenderly with the voice of a mother. "I need a blanket. I need something to wrap him up in." She looked up at me as she spoke. I immediately went back into the house, ushering my kids back into the home as I went. My son looked upset, and my daughter was crying. I needed to comfort them. But first, I wanted to do what Mrs. Skoll's had asked. I confiscated one of our old beach towels for the duty and took it to her. She took it with a small nod of thanks. She wrapped the body as gently as she could. Her movements were slow and purposeful, almost reverent. The cat had been her friend, companion, and confidant for many years. When she stood up with the cat carefully wrapped, she let out a slight grunt exertion. I moved to help her, but she shook her head. "I can carry him. I need to do right by him," she rasped as she walked towards her home. "Do you need help burying him?" "I have a shovel," I called after her. She didn't turn, but she spoke as she disappeared into her home. "That won't be necessary," she said before the door closed behind her. We didn't see Mrs. Skoll's for 3 days. The kids brought flowers and left them on her porch. My wife made her a casserole, and others also brought over baked goods. She never answered when we knocked, so we left everything by her front door. Later, we would see they were gone, so we knew she was at least receiving everything. That poor woman, my wife teared up as she spoke. I know she must be so lonely with her cat gone. We should invite her over for dinner. We tried, but the phone rang without anyone ever picking it up. Whatever grief Mrs. Scholes was experiencing, she wanted to be left alone with it. The death of Diego seemed to embolden Victor. We started to find pieces of cheese and meat with nails and tacks stuck in them in our backyard. It was sheer luck. My wife had found them before our dog did. Our neighbors reported the same thing and started to install security cameras. By this point, we had called the police, but there was nothing they could do. We had no footage of Victor entering our yard or witnesses. Disgusted with the lack of help, I told my wife I was going to install outdoor cameras all over our house in the hopes of catching him red-handed. We also started looking at other houses, and we weren't the only ones. The Nugents were looking too. It broke my heart because I loved our house, but this guy was escalating and I was at a loss. I had to protect my family somehow. On the third night after Diego's death, we started hearing the yowling. I sat bolt right up in our bed when I heard it. Beside me, my wife was awake too, her eyes wide in the dim light of the bedroom. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. Outside, the yowl continued unabated. If anything, it was getting louder. It was like it wanted attention. "Are you going to go check it out?" my wife whispered again. Honestly, I didn't want to leave the bed. But if the animal we were hearing was loud enough to wake us up, the kids might be awake too, terrified in their beds and too afraid to move. I crept from the bedroom as quietly as I could. I used the flashlight on my phone so I wouldn't disturb the kids if they weren't already awake by turning on the hall light. I checked their rooms, and somehow, thankfully, they were still asleep. My son was even snoring lightly, which would have been cute in different circumstances. Stepping outside, I could finally hear the direction it was coming from. It was coming from the patch of woods behind Victor's house. My neighbor Mark Roth was outside as well. He was in his pajamas and his robe, carrying a baseball bat and a flashlight. He caught my eye, and we exchanged knowing glances. Across the cul-de-sac, most of the lights were on, and I could see neighbors looking out windows, trying to find the source of the sound. Even Victor's lights were on, which was unusual. Mr. Roth walked over and gestured with the baseball bat. "I think it's coming from the woods behind Victor's house. I bet you anything that sick monster has an animal stuck in a bear trap or something else wicked," he spat. That was something that I hadn't considered before, but it sounded more like an enraged animal to me than an injured one. But then again, I had never heard anything like this before. "Should we check it out?" I asked Mark, feeling braver now that someone was with me. "Yeah, we should," Mark hissed. "I'd love to catch that guy in the act so I can justify using this," he said, swinging the bat for emphasis. I wasn't sure what to say to that. I wanted this night to end without any kind of violence, even if it was against a crazy guy like Victor. We started our slow walk to the end of the cul-de-sac when the sound abruptly stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. Mark and I looked at each other, stunned by the sudden silence. "I guess it ran off," I suggested weakly. Since there was no longer any yowling to investigate, we parted ways, and I went back home. I crept inside as quietly as I could, so I wouldn't wake the kids. I glanced in their rooms one more time to check on them, and they were still sleeping soundly. In our bedroom, my wife was wide-eyed and staring at me, her phone in hand. "Did you find out what it was?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "I almost called the cops," she whispered, setting the phone down. I'm not sure the cops would come out to investigate a case of strange howling. I bet it was just a coyote in heat or something, I said, trying to reassure her, and also convince myself. We heard the yowling the next night, and the night after that. You could almost set your watch by it. The inhuman screech was both punctual and terrifying. It eventually woke up our son, who came running into our bedroom terrified. I didn't go outside, but from the window, I saw Mark walking around with a flashlight in one hand and his bat in another. Victor's lights were also on, even though I did not see him leave the house. It would always cease abruptly after 15 or 20 minutes of almost continuous screeching. By the third night, it had woken up our daughter as well. The shriek seemed louder and more frenzied that night, and it had my whole family in tears. It scared my wife enough that she called the police. The patrol car did finally show up to patrol the area. The next morning, we all emerged from our houses feeling shell-shocked. The kids had insisted on sleeping in our bed, and we didn't want to kick them out. Frankly, I felt safer having them close by. As I walked out to my mailbox to retrieve the morning paper, I saw Mrs. Scholes sitting forlornly on her front porch. It was the first time I'd seen her since Diego died. I walked over, waving, my spirits raised at the sight of our beloved neighbor. My smile faltered as I got closer and saw her disheveled appearance. She looked haggard, and her white hair was down instead of in its usual impeccable bun. Dark circles were under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days, and her thin frame looked even thinner under her dress. Mrs. Scholes, we were getting worried about you. No one has seen you for days, I gushed, stopping a few feet away. She looked over at me slowly, as if her neck was sore. She offered up a weak smile. I'm sorry if I made any of you worry. I had been busy. I was working on something special, and I couldn't be away from it. Is it one of your quilts? I inquired, trying to keep the conversation going. She smiled slightly and nodded. Something like that, she answered. Mrs. Scholes stood up suddenly and turned towards her front door. If you'll excuse me, I've not been feeling well. I think I'll make some tea and lay down. I waved lamely as she went back into her house. I couldn't think of anything else to say. If my wife had been here, she would have asked if she needed some food or anything else, or invited her to dinner. With nothing left to do outside, I walked back into my home. I tried working on some small home repairs, but I was distracted. My wife had sent the kids to her parents for the weekend, partly for us to have some time to ourselves, but mostly for them to avoid the strange howling we were afraid would come again tonight. Do you think we should call animal control? My wife asked, looking out the window as evening fell. Our neighbors already did. I think they're coming to set traps or something. But no one in animal control is going to come out at midnight and wait for some weird animal to start howling. My wife kept glancing out the window as if she expected something to jump out at her. Still, we managed to have a good evening. We ordered Chinese and ate it while watching a movie. In the evening, we sat outside and drank some wine. It was rare that we got a child-free evening, so we tried to enjoy it as much as possible. My wife fell asleep quite early, helped in no small part by the 5 glasses of wine she had consumed. I couldn't fall asleep, even after drinking a couple of beers. If the howling started again, I knew it would wake me up anyway. To pass the time, I fired up my PlayStation and enjoyed some solo gaming time, something I usually didn't get with the kids around. I kept glancing at the clock. If midnight came and went without that ungodly screeching, I could finally get some sleep. I was looking forward to sleeping in without the kids bouncing on our bed asking for chocolate chip pancakes. As midnight crept closer, I shut everything down and dimmed the lights. Everything was eerily quiet. There were none of the usual nighttime sounds. Even cars passing by sounded muffled. The air that night seemed expectant, as if everything was waiting for midnight. I'm not sure why, but I went out the front door and stood on our porch. I kept the lights off and took the moment to enjoy the silence. It was nice. The stars were bright tonight, and I found myself staring up at them, briefly wondering how much a good telescope would cost. The yowling started too suddenly. It made me jump. Across the neighborhood, the lights stayed off. Either they were sitting in the dark like I was, or they were sleeping. I looked down the length of the neighborhood and saw that Victor's lights were on. His front door was wide open too, yawning open like some surprised mouth. In the weeks that Victor had lived here, I hadn't seen inside his house. Even from a distance, I could see it was cluttered and unkempt. Moving boxes still sat untouched. But there was no sign of Victor. The hair on my arms stood on end as the howling continued. It sounded louder this time, more insistent, maybe even desperate. Before I could think, I was running towards the sound and the open door of Victor's house. I wanted to finally see what this thing was. Drinking had emboldened me, when before I had been cautious. I did stop long enough to grab a fallen tree branch off the ground. It was a foot long and several inches thick. It wasn't much, but it made me feel better to be armed with something. I approached Victor's door and peered inside. The smell of the place assaulted me even from a few feet away. The smell was acrid and stale, like unwashed bodies and cigarette smoke. Stepping away, I heard the animal scream again. It was closer. It sounded a lot larger than I had previously thought. Miss Vaughn's porch light snapped on. She must have been awoken by the scream. I watched as Miss Vaughn stepped carefully out of her back door, wearing a robe and clutching her cell phone, her eyes wide as she looked at me. Before I could say anything, there was another scream, this time a human coming from the wooded area behind the houses. It sounded pained and terrified. I ran towards the sound. Pointing at Miss Vaughn, I yelled, "Call 911. I think Victor is being attacked." I ran past the houses into the woods. The woods were not especially deep or thick, but the light that was coming from the houses barely illuminated anything, and I mentally cursed myself for not having my phone with me. I could use the flashlight. A bright flash and a loud bang came from deeper amongst the trees, followed by another and another. My blood ran cold. They were gunshots. Victor was shooting at the animal, or at me. I backed away and started to jog back to the street when something large ran into me, knocking me off my feet. I dropped the tree branch and rolled, letting out an oomph as the air left my lungs. It was Victor. He'd been knocked off his feet too and was on the ground next to me, staring past us into the woods, at the place where he'd been firing his gun. He was crab walking backwards, still on the ground, trying to get his feet under him. His face was bloodied and his shirt was torn. I stared at him, still stunned when he let out a high, keening moan. He was scared. Victor looked at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. They were terrified. I'd never seen anyone so terrified.
"It's the devil. It's the devil,"
he shrieked in a high-pitched wail.
"It's coming for me. I shot it, but it keeps coming."
He yelped as he finally got his feet under him and ran off into the darkness. I lay in the dirt, still stunned. I was terrified Victor had gone off to get his gun and start firing again. Something leapt in front of me, and I tensed and covered my head, anticipating the madman and his rifle. But it wasn't Victor. The stench of the thing hit me before my eyes could fully process what they were seeing. It was an animal, but one that shouldn't have existed outside of a nightmare. It was rotting. Even as it stood in front of me, I could smell the putrescence roll off of it. The size of a large dog, it was a mad amalgamation of different animal parts that had been seemingly stitched together. The body was half dog and half deer, with rows of broken antlers, mismatched bones, and teeth on its back like a porcupine. It was a mad patchwork of skin and fur that was sloughing off even as it stood in front of me. But the head was what shocked the breath from me. It was Diego. His head was sewn onto this thing. His face was comically small against the large body to which he had been attached. He looked at me, his eyes a deep and bloody crimson that glinted in the weak light. I saw no recognition in those eyes. He hissed and let out a yowl that made me scream. This was what had been making those god-awful noises for the past several nights. This monstrosity, this dead abomination. It turned its head in the direction that Victor had fled, let out a triumphant growl, and bounded off into the night. I crawled away from that place. I couldn't get my feet under me. I was so terrified. Miss Vaughn found me. She was crying as she helped me off the ground. I heard the gun. I thought he had killed you, she half screamed. The cops came. They took statements and began their search for Victor. I left out the part of a large undead cat creature. I was certain that no one would believe me. I'm not sure I believed it. It didn't take long to find Victor. He had run a full 2 miles right onto the highway. Witnesses said they'd seen him running and screaming into traffic. He ran in front of a semi that couldn't stop in time, and what was left of him was strewn across the freeway. It was terrible to say that the whole neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief when they heard that he had died. Everyone assumed he had been on some kind of drug. I don't know if they tested what was left of his body, but I'm certain if they did, they wouldn't find anything. It was not drugs that had forced Victor Carmody into traffic. That terrible howling stopped as well. I assumed that it had fulfilled its purpose and was gone now. I hoped it was gone. Maybe Diego was resting in peace now. We all went back to normal surprisingly fast. No one mourned the death of our neighbor. There wasn't even a funeral. His extended family came and quietly removed all his belongings from his house before putting it back onto the market. It sold well below market value because Victor had torn it up inside and they wanted it gone as soon as possible. Miss Vaughn's parents actually bought the place. They were recently retired and wanted to live closer to their only daughter and grandchildren. And what could be closer than next door? They even invited us over for a cookout. Every trace of Victor was gone, and it was replaced with framed photos of laughing children, tasteful decor, and a beige carpet. It was surreal. I kept looking out past the backyard fence, as if expecting to see that monster again. It's been months now, but I can't get that image of that creature out of my mind. If I sit still long enough, I can even imagine its stomach-churning smell. I can't look Mrs. Scholes in the face anymore. She waves and tries to make small talk, and I always try to come up with an excuse to leave. The way she smiles at me, I think that she knows that I know. She's back to her old self as well. We could see her quilting on the front porch while the weather was nice, drinking her tea, weeding her garden, and now that it's colder, we can see her silhouette inside the house, still drinking tea and quilting. She even got another cat, a sleek gray tabby she named Mateo. I really hope nothing bad ever happens to that cat. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.